and we'll start that over. So, okay, well, I want to welcome everybody to the second presentation under our Roy W. Browning Faculty Symposium series. We're honored and grateful for the generous gift presented by Roy and Jerry Browning that was given with an emphasis on teaching and learning, and has made it possible to offer our Faculty Development Series Symposium. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Olam, who is going to introduce our speaker for the day, and then she will be turning it over to him to take it away.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I am just thrilled to have been invited to introduce Dr. Bryan Alexander to the Ottawa University community, and I'm so excited to see so many of us have made time for this opportunity today. I have to apologize, I'm traveling, there's a little bit of background noise, hopefully you can hear me okay. So I met Bryan over 25 years ago when I was working in way upstate New York. Bryan was working at an organization called NITELY, National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education, which was a nonprofit that had a mission to help small colleges and universities integrate their digital technologies. And at that time, that was located in Middlebury, Vermont. And I followed his career ever since that time, something that Twitter has made much easier for me in recent years.
Bryan, you muted.
Sorry.
You're still muted there, Corrine.
When the Browning series made this gift possible, this web series possible, Bryan's name was the first name that came to mind. I've been so appreciative of all the work he's done in the higher education technology space, and I'm so thrilled that we've been able to snag him. When you hear what I'm about to tell you about his work, you'll be amazed that he had any time at all for us. Bryan earned his PhD at the University of Michigan in 1997 in English Language and Literature. His dissertation was about, wait for it, doppelgangers in Romantic era fiction and poetry. He's an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, blogger, speaker, consultant, and teacher focused on how technology transforms education. He consults throughout the higher education space in the United States and abroad.
Corrine, you're muted.
He frequently conducts workshops and gives keynotes throughout the higher education space in the United States and abroad. Bryan frequently conducts workshops, gives keynotes, and his articles have appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Inside Higher Ed, and he has been interviewed and featured in the Washington Post, MSNBC, U.S. News and World Report, National Public Radio, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Pew Research, and Campus Technology. And I've also heard him on the Teaching and Learning Higher Ed podcast. He keeps his fingers in the higher education real world as a senior scholar at Georgetown University, where he teaches graduate seminars in the Learning, Design, and Technology program. He's the author of Gearing Up for Learning Beyond K-12 and the new Digital Storytelling, Creating Narratives with New Media. And hot off the press, his latest book, Academia Next, The Futures of Higher Education, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And yes, I did say futures plural. And if that's not enough, Bryan is a prolific blogger. His blogs are available in a weekly email digest form, which I commend to you highly. He's currently blogging about the future of higher education and climate change, a topic I haven't given any thought to. And on top of all of this, Bryan hosts a weekly online open invitation forum, which takes place on the amazing Shindig platform. It's called the Future Trends Forum, and Bryan interviews a variety of thought leaders about the latest trends in higher education, and best of all, he offers these weekly events free of charge. In fact, this week's forum starts for him in 50 minutes. So I'd best turn this show over to Bryan. Bryan, welcome to Ottawa University. And colleagues, please join me in welcoming Bryan Alexander. If your camera's not on, please turn it on and show him your hands. You don't have to turn on your mic, but please show him your applause. Take it away, Bryan.
Oh, Corrine, thank you so much. Thank you so much for such an incredibly sweet introduction. I'm flabbergasted and utterly moved. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? And you can indicate that with your thumbs up or in the chat box, just type in something. Great, excellent. Well, greetings to you from Utah. I am in town to work with a university tomorrow, and I came in early in part so that I could do this video work with you all. It's a real pleasure to get to know a little bit more about Ottawa. I would love to hear more about you and your work as we go. Here's my plan. The topic is digital storytelling. We're going to dive into what this means for education. And in order to do this, I'm going to show you some slides, but more importantly, talk you through some concepts and show you a bit of video so you can understand where this comes from. what I would love to do with you is I would love to hear your thoughts. So I will ask you questions. If you have questions, comments, objections, howls of outrage, or projects you'd like to propose, please do so. I'll be monitoring the chat box, ably edited by Andrea. Also, I'd love to hear from you via video using this technology. And let me just say once again, thank you, Ottawa, for being superb virtual hosts. So to begin with, let me start off by giving you a touch of what digital storytelling is. So a couple of things to begin with. I'm going to crash through the idea of storytelling first, and then what I call classical digital storytelling, and then talk about some new forms, and then plunge into educational uses. So again, along the way, I would love to hear what you think. So to begin with, one of the key things that we think about is what the heck is storytelling, and why are we talking about this in the educational context? It's a tricky thing to think about because to begin with, storytelling is something that we often recognize but really have a hard time pinning down. We all value it highly, but it's often something that's difficult for us to trace the contours of. And there are a lot of different examples of it. If you ask people what story is, they often go with what we call the Freytag triangle. And I think you all recognize this, even if you haven't seen it in person or named as such. This is coined by a 19th century German philosopher. And I think you all recognize this. This is when you begin a story with some kind of initial laying out of the story terrain, and then you push into the rising action, which builds to a climax, followed by falling action, and then you have a denouement. And this is a pretty commonplace structure that people tend to accept. Another one that you may not know by name, but you've all experienced if you watch Hollywood movies, is what the folklorist Joseph Campbell referred to as the monomyth. That is, a story is a kind of personal arc where you start from somebody who begins usually in humble origins, gets a call to action, has an epic adventure with certain pieces and certain ebbs and flows, and then concludes with a triumph. Hollywood is very, very fond of this. The first Star Wars movie is perhaps the most famous example. In fact, it's so well known that there are movies which make fun of it, like the excellent movie Adaptation. And as you can see here from this cartoon, people like to make fun of it in other media as well. For some people, storytelling is actually a very personal thing, story equals the person. It can be a biography, or it can be an autobiography, or something that really speaks closely to what we think of as the human being. And there are twists on this. Sometimes that can be about someone who's important. And those of you who follow books know that the category of nonfiction called biography, autobiography, is one of the best-selling and has been for a long, long time. Sometimes stories are about an important event. Or sometimes they can be simply about what one does, one's mission, one's job, one's vocation. And just one quick note, when I'm saying story, please know that I'm referring to both fiction and nonfiction. The term story is very promiscuous. It covers both. And of course, in 2019, we are actually pretty good at blending fiction and nonfiction in all kinds of ways. So before that, let me just ask, before I dive into this, just quickly, what do you think of when you think of story? What are some of the pieces that have to go into something for it to be a story? Let me just hear from you.
There have to be characters. Characters.
Ow, that's a really good one. Yeah, it's kind of hard to have a story without characters, although we do try at different times, right? I would think of, for example, the Twilight books, which feel like they have no characters, but we have to have that. Corinne points out setting. Amy adds scenes. So there has to be some place and location. Amy's point about scenes is very interesting. Amy, if you mean scenes in the sense of drama, where there has to be a sequence of action. Matthew asks fiction. Matthew, just quickly, do you mean fiction or friction?
No, I meant fiction, actually. I just meant to say that, like, very
good.
That when I hear the word story, it makes me think of something that was created rather than dispassionately reported, like nonfiction would be.
I got it. Thank you. Karen mentions one of the crucial aspects, which is change or conflict. And when I say crucial, this is actually one of the hardest things to do in making a story, is actually to share change or conflict. We'll come back to that. Laura brings back setting in plot, descriptive details, and Corinne fleshes out people to include protagonist and antagonist. Very good. This is all... Oh, got some feedback there. Thank you. It's okay.
Can you hear me okay?
I can. Is that Frank?
I would say, yeah, Frank, a morality tale, I think my favorites are the Twilight Zone series, because whatever the fantasy, science fiction, etc., always a morality tale.
Absolutely.
That and really wins.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but your point is absolutely right. And Rod Serling always ended each episode with the point, and a moral lesson to be learned. You could think about the classic Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which ends with Sterling just really brutally lecturing you about stories and attitudes. It's a fantastically important thing. Go back to Aesop fables, which are always about a message, always about a moral. Well, this is great. You guys are already ahead of the curve, so I'll have to advance more quickly then. One of the things that I like to ask people is how much mystery plays a role. Now, I don't mean murder mystery. I don't mean detective shows. I mean how much of a story involves things that we don't know. So when Matthew was talking about fiction, I think this is a key part of it, is that storytelling often discloses, but it also hides some content. Let me just give you an example, a couple of examples. This is the first line of a short story from the middle of the 20th century, science fiction story. The last man on Earth sat alone in a room. There was a knock at the door. It's one of the most famous opening lines, because you get that sense of, oh my gosh, who could it be? I mean, you get a little frisson, a little thrill when you hear that gap. And I think a lot of stories begin or use that kind of mystery to it. For example, anyone recognize this opening line? It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Anybody get that one? If you ever feel bad about your writing, take a look at the manuscript for the opening page of 1984. This first line is about the 12th version of that first line. Orwell wrote it, crossed it off, edited it, turned it around, changed it. But this line gives you that creepy bit of, how can clock strike 13, right? And the answer is military time. Or some of you might recognize this opening line, especially women in the audience. Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. Anybody catch that? Daphne du Maurier, Rebecca. Fantastic novel. But this line gives you a little hint of mystery as well, because of that word again. It makes you wonder, wait a minute, where are we in the story? Did we miss something? How could she be going back? We just started. Where are things happening? Stories often have that element where they just give you that little buzz, that little bit of curiosity that makes you want to turn the page. Or, just to keep going with the story. As Gregor Samsa woke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect, from Kafka's famous tale. And you can do this in other media as well. You can do it with visuals. This is a mid-18th century series of engravings by Piranesi called Imagined Prisons. And you can see that if you look at the edges of these images, that there's no clear edge. There's always these lines lead elsewhere. The galleries, the bridges, the stairways, they just keep going and going and going. And your eyes keep following it along. Think about old maps, which would have, blank spaces and here be dragons. A visual way of giving you that sense of mystery. But let me ask you this question instead. This is a trickier one. What isn't storytelling? What blocks storytelling? What's anti-storytelling? Deborah put strategy. Oh, Deborah, I'd love to hear more about that. Amy says lecturing, presumably bad lecturing. Laura puts a list of facts. Right. Deborah gets even subtler, linear thinking. And Frank builds on that by saying, giving it no beginning or end. Nagging from Amy. Yes. Or complain. There's a theme going on here. Excellent, excellent. Now, these are all communication styles. These are all presentation styles, but these are ones that lack story. They don't have storyness in them. Now, they are stuff that we can turn into story. So, you think about Frank's point about no beginning or end. That's stuff that you could then add a beginning and end to, frame it out and go with the story. Amy's point about lecturing. I mean, a good lecturer can actually tell a good story. And, Laura's point about complaining, there's a long literature of complaining. But again, it has to be beaten into shape. It has to be warped into story. We need to have characters, beginning and end, and so on. Very good. Very good. There are a lot of ways we can do this. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I'm not a sports person, so I enjoy this one a lot. One character says, a weighted random number generator just produced a new batch of numbers. Let's use them to build narratives. And that's basically, in a sense, sports narratives. But again, you have to build the narratives for that to work. You have to turn them into something. In my first book, I have a definition, and there's always, a good definition is often very pithy, very short, very elegant, and a bad definition is like a grocery store cart full of objects. And that's what my definition is here, I'm afraid. I couldn't get it any pithier. But let me just break this down really quickly. I argue that a story is for a given audience, and that really matters, right? I mean, some stories live for certain audiences and then completely die for other audiences. The story is a sequence of content. And so we go back to, again, these questions that you've all been raising about linear sequences. Amy's point about scenes. It has to be a sequence over time. Anchored on a problem. Again, we need that sense of friction. We need something to struggle with. And it engages that audience with emotion and meaning. And often this is a key thing about stories, is they can't leave us cold. They have to connect with us emotionally. The meaning part is the so what. Why should we pay attention to the story? Why does this matter to us? So why are we talking about digital storytelling? Now, my hypothesis is that whenever humans invent a new communication technology, we figure out ways of telling stories with it. We've done this since the birth of writing. You could think, for example, about how in the 1700s, the novel took off in part because of growing popularity of print. You can think about how in the early 20th century, we started radio storytelling once radio took off. In the middle of the 20th century, we had concept albums like, say, Tommy from The Who, because the technology enabled us to tell stories that were long enough. With television, we created a new form of serial storytelling, which we're enjoying the renaissance of right now. So it was only natural, I think, that with the digital world, we start telling stories. And there's a whole prehistory of this, which I find endlessly fascinating. In the 1990s, people told stories with hypertext and with the web. Are you all familiar with Choose Your Own Adventures? If you haven't seen one of these, Matthew recognizes them. These are children's books that are very clever, where each page represents a certain part of the story. And each page has a possibility of a branching narrative. So you read a page which says, okay, you're in Arizona. You just arrived at the town of Jerome. Do you climb down the mountain or do you enter a shop? And if you want to enter a shop, you turn to page 75. If you want to climb down the mountain, you turn to page 95. And then that leads you to another decision point and so on. So each of these basically, it's a form of branching narrative. And people used digital media to do the same thing. We did this with web browsers. Sometimes we connected them to offline content. And then there are other forms of storytelling too. You could think about early forms of urban legends online, which often succeeded. Frank, I'm going to come to gaming, coming right up, because there's a lot of storytelling there. We also had virtual community facilitation of stories. Started back in the 80s with Usenet. And there are a lot of art projects doing this. There's a British outfit called Dreaming Methods that was one of the first adopters of Flash. that use web pages to produce a kind of disintegrated story that people would work through by clicking through different parts of it. There's a wonderful, wonderful Canadian digital story, which just used the website to basically create a whole series of media content that you would page through, fleshing out the story of a town in Canada that no longer exists. People have been using these in web design ever since the 20th century. In fact, there's a very commonplace method of invented by the New York Times called the snowfall pattern, which uses a single web page and has content that flows down it. And the content is multimedia. It integrates different things. For example, this is a story about the highway that connects St. Petersburg and Moscow. And you can see on the left, there's a map connecting, showing you where you are. In the middle is text, and on the right is different bits of multimedia, either audio or video. And it's called Snowfall. It's named after the first article they did in this because, in part, it flows down, like an avalanche or snow going down the page. There are other examples as well. I'm very fond of a little urban legend / short story that was turned into a web page called Ted's Caving Journal, about a guy named Ted who goes caving, unsurprisingly. And each page represents a journal entry as he talks about this new cave he found and how exciting it is. And as you go on, at the bottom of each page is a little arrow, click here for the next entry. It gets more and more creepy and unsettling. The cave gets more and more disturbing. And then you come to a page which says, all right, I found the last room of the cave. I'm going to take some pictures and I'm going to get out. I think I know what's going on. Click here to continue. When you press click here to continue, there is no next page. Nice and creepy. Very October-oriented story. And we've been doing this with comedy as well. People have been doing, the Nigerian spam email is always a short story, and we've been making fun of it. This is one, for example, that uses the Nigerian spam story to make fun of the 2008 bailout of American banks. Now, at the same time as this happened in the 1990s, there was also a movement that came out of the San Francisco Bay Area. A bunch of community activists and artists wanted to figure out how to use digital video to tell stories. So they did a lot of work for a few years and came up with a pedagogy and a curriculum that simply worked, and people have been using it ever since. And when people say digital storytelling, this is often what they have in mind. So let me just explain it, and then we play a quick example of it so you can see how it works. The idea of the digital storytelling movement is that participants create roughly a 3-minute digital story. They do this starting from scratch. The workshops, the classes always assume people have no common baseline of technology. So they teach just enough image scanning and image manipulation, audio recording and video editing, just enough to get something done. The typical workshop takes about 3 full days. That can be spread out over other periods of time if you like. The key thing is the story is an autobiographical one. It can be about one's job. It can be about one's immigration story, family, of crisis, whatever. And then it's not shot video necessarily. It's all kinds of multimedia, photos, animations, soundtracks, all chunked together. It's enormously effective, and it's been a hit ever since. The BBC launched 2 digital storytelling movements, one for working people in Britain, one for the small country of Wales. There are digital storytelling projects all over the world. In fact, if the people who did it weren't such counterculture people, they would have licensed it to Apple or trademarked the term. But as it is, it's completely open source. If you Google the phrase digital storytelling, you'll find tons and tons of examples. In fact, let me just give you guys an example myself here. Let me just switch over to, oops, hang on one second. Let me pull over to show you one video example. And let me know if you can hear the sound. Okay, and let me give this a full screen. So again, this is an autobiographical story. It's about 3 minutes long. And keep in mind, the person who made this did so without any professional background at all. Let's take a look.
Mi familia es numerosa, 7 hermanas y el menor un varón. Mi niñez fue como el alegre color de los campos. Disfrutaba tanto estudiar con mis amiguitos del pueblo. Todos hablábamos el mismo idioma y nos entendíamos muy bien. Tiempo después, papá vive unos problemas fuertes y decide llevarnos a vivir en la ciudad, lugar en el que pasamos muchas necesidades. Yo venía de un pueblo indígena y solo hablaba maya, y a pesar de las burlas, inocentemente aprendí a hablar el idioma español. Aún muy pequeños, mi padre nos abandonó. Desde entonces, a mis 11 años, mis hermanas y yo trabajamos en la recolección de botellas para venderlos, limpiando trastes, cortando y vendiendo leñas para ayudar a mamá. Más adelante, obtuve una beca indígena para seguir mis estudios de secundaria y bachillerato. También trabajé como asesora en educación para adultos y con esto ya tenía un sueldo mensual. Desde muy pequeña luché por estudiar a pesar de las carencias. Cuando papá visitaba a la familia, muchas veces me trató de menos y con palabras muy fuertes me hacía sentir mal. Me discriminó por ser mujer. Él pensaba que la mujer no tenía por qué estudiar. Él siempre estuvo a favor de sus sobrinos varones, pero menos de sus hijas. Nunca se preocupó por la educación de mis hermanas. Como respuesta a toda esta situación, tomé la decisión de seguir preparándome, con la esperanza de que algún día podría demostrarle a mi padre que yo valía mucho como mujer. Con dolor recuerdo de cada sufrir, cada barrera en mi paso, hasta terminar la universidad. La discriminación a la mujer indígena ha sido un verdadero obstáculo que nos limita la preparación. Mujer, hoy quiero decirte que tenemos igualdad en derecho. Empieza hoy tu lucha para un mejor futuro.
Let me just pull out a couple of details about that story just to show you a few things about it, and then I want to hear what you thought about it. So note a couple of things. That the soundtrack has two different pieces to it. We have music.
Mi niñez fue como el alegre color de los...
And we have voice. The digital storytelling people actually refer to this as the gift of voice, that a person's unique voice is fascinating and powerful. There's also, let me turn off the sound, the visuals are also not simple. So we have photographs, we have title cards, but also notice how sometimes they move. There's a very, very basic animation in some of these images, which again, you can learn to use depending on which tool you have. And a lot, say we close in here, for example, or we add color. We move back and forth. And there's also an embedded video clip. In this case, it's the speaker studying, I believe. So let me ask you, what did you think of this story? Was it moving, powerful? Oh, okay. Yeah. And frankly, it really is simple. It's very direct. Inspiring. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a good point about that final message, where it all builds up to that. Again, we come to that point of a moral, right? Good point, Amy. Good point about proving someone wrong. Well, and again, it's about 3 minutes long. This is 3:15. So let me just talk about how Agreed, Laura. Agreed. And in fact, the digital storytelling movement is kind of the leader of this is the Story Center group, and they have a very strong social justice orientation. They really focus on giving voice to people who are normally marginalized or voiceless. So they do a lot of work with LGBTQ youth. They work with people in long-term medical care. They work with immigrants. They have a very, very solid mission. And again, since their pedagogy, their curriculum is open source, anybody can take advantage of it. So let me go back to here. Let me just get out of the full screen for this, and let me just recommend if you're interested, go to the Story Center archive on YouTube. It's just, I believe it's a Center of the Story. But if you just search for Story Center as one word, you'll find an awful lot of stuff. And we can say more about that. Let me just quickly come back to where we were in the in our discussion. So that's one example. The digital storytelling movement has been, there we go. It has grown off and mutated in all kinds of ways. Some of you might recognize the StoryCorps project at National Public Radio. You might recognize some educational uses. Starting in 2003, I worked with, as Corinne mentioned, the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education. We worked with hundreds of small colleges to get them, among other things, doing stuff with digital storytelling. And we found some interesting variations. People want to do non-personal narratives, which we completely supported. And there's also some campus stories. People did stories about IT, for example, using stories to teach people policies. And then ever since, the amount of educational support and number of educational projects has just grown enormously. A lot of people who do digital storytelling are very passionate about it, so they'll share their rubrics, they'll share PowerPoint presentations, they'll share examples of all kinds. There's a lot of articles. I mean, my book is obviously the best, but there are other books as well. And it's interesting to think about, I mean, in terms of education, why you would do this, why you would spend time having students make stories. And one of the reasons is because it gets students to think differently. You get, if you're not writing a paper, if you're not giving a presentation, you have to make some interesting motions. So the Carnarvon group in Wales, for example, has this idea that you get to move between embodied narrative and abstract symbolic knowledge back and forth, which is actually a really good exercise for students. There are many other pedagogical angles as well. If you believe in constructivist pedagogy, that is, the creation of meaning by student work, creation of learning, this is a very good constructivist pedagogy. If you believe in student voice, that's a good that you're trying to achieve. You're going to help students express and learn their voice. This is one way. Laura, I really appreciate it. I'm glad that you could participate so far, and I look forward to hearing more from you. And here, if you want, everybody, let me just quickly, if you don't have it already, let me just put my email address in the chat box. So if you want to ping me, I'd be delighted to hear from you. If you want to get people thinking about media critically, making media is a fantastic way to empower students to think critically about it. In fact, one of the fun things I've had whenever I teach these workshops is inevitably someone will go home and watch a commercial or see a trailer or watch a movie or a TV show, and then they'll think, oh, I see what they were doing there. This makes more sense to me. If you want to reach out to generations of students who are immersed in media, sometimes this is a really good way. And again, if you want to teach job skills, there's a lot going on here. There's the technical skills in making a digital video, but also then there's the, being able to communicate effectively is obviously a major job skill. So what I described was happening as of 2004. But the technology world moves very fast, and we keep developing new technologies, new forms. And so one part of that is we involve new ways of telling stories. So let me just quickly mention a few of these in a hurry, because I'm conscious of time. I want to cut to the chase. People have been using social media to tell stories in all kinds of ways. For example, one way of thinking about blogging is as a kind of diary or journal, just in backwards order. We've been telling stories with diaries and journals forever, and so it's unsurprising that people have been blogging stories that way. And there are many examples I can point to for this. People do this with Tumblr using multimedia. This, for example, is a project which about 10 years ago, the idea was for people to show their relationship to the concept of the 99%. And the goal was that people had to basically make a single slice of a story. They had to write on a piece of paper their relationship to the 99% concept, hold it up for a photo, and share it. So if you look at this one, you get this handwritten note. My dad died from cancer at the age of 44. We're still paying off his law school loans. We are the 99%. That's a short story right by itself, but then look at the woman behind it. Right? This adds more to it, gives it more punch. And this is one of my favorite ones. I'm 71 and well off, but the economic woes of others impacts my well-being. We're linked to one another, and only as strong as the weakest among us. I, too, am the 99%. Look at her face. And in fact, in 2012, if we can go back a little bit in political history, the Obama campaign for re-election invited people to do digital storytelling, which was a big shot in the arm for a lot of us in that field. We're very excited to see that. If the federal government could do digital storytelling, then anybody can. There are a few other examples. People use Twitter for digital storytelling all the time. It sounds impossible, but on the one hand, you can cram a story into a very small space. I mean, for example, the shortest saddest science fiction story of all time, robot looking for signs of life has broken down a New Zealand coal mine. Or the famous Hemingway line, 6 words, for sale, baby shoes, never used, which gets parodied a lot. I really like this one. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Yeah, my wife said it's irresponsible to spend $160 on baby-sized Jordans just to clarify my baby is not dead. Optimist drowned in half-full bathtub. Cunning terrorist uses only red wires. You can have a lot of fun with this. And in fact, there are many, many examples, including a historical one. This is a screenshot from a gentleman who lived in Pakistan and lived in the town where Osama bin Laden was caught and killed. And he was tweeting about the experience. And if you read his tweets, including the responses, you basically get a live, in-person digital short story about one of the most significant events of the 21st century. People have used many other projects, and I can give you more examples, including on Facebook, and I can say more, but I think you get the idea. There are many examples of these online. I've archived a lot of these and characterized them. They're all fascinating in different ways. Small town noir is one of my favorite. The idea is that this person goes into small town police records and just uploads the short stories that result. I want to skip ahead to a couple of things very, very quickly and just mention podcasting. The current second wave of podcasts has been fantastic for digital stories. I'm just curious, do any of you hear digital stories via podcast? Any examples in particular that you really like? That was an enthusiastic yes from Karen right there. So yeah, Serial kicked off the second wave of podcasting. Teaching in higher ed is a very nice one, Corinne. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of podcasting going on. Oh, Karen, I want to hear that. Let me know which ones are there. Have you heard the one called The Message? That's really good. Oh, yeah. Karen, we need to talk. We got a lot of stuff to talk about for that. So podcasting is one, but you can do even simpler forms. So, for example, images can tell a story famously, pictures worth 1,000 words and so on. And so there have been many attempts to create stories just using images. So for example, on Flickr, a social photo sharing site, there's a project called Tell a Story in 5 Frames. And the goal is you have to upload 5 images and a title and nothing else. And that should tell the story. So for example, this is one called The Chase. So here's picture 1. Picture 2. So now we have characters, birds, baby. Picture 3. So if you have the Freytag triangle, we're kind of at the climax moment there. Picture 4. And picture 5. A nice little short story. Here's another one. You can give, pedagogically, you can give students access to pre-existing images and ask them to arrange them into a story, or ask them to find images and make them into a story. So this is one using public domain images published by the Library of Congress. It's called Farm to Food. Let me just show you this. So again, this is a remix. Right? These aren't original photos. So here's photo 1. There's the titular farm. Photo 2. photo 3, photo 4, number 5. I look at this one every few months because this always moves me. No consistent character, no fiction as such, but I think the arc is pretty clear. Deborah mentions Adobe Spark. Deborah, if you want to say something in the chat or in video, actually, if you want to say something in the chat about Adobe Spark, go ahead. I'm going to come, if you want to say more out loud, let me circle back to you because I want to talk about tools in just a couple of minutes. One of you asked about gaming and storytelling, and the gaming industry is very, very fond of storytelling. Storytelling is a way of, we tell stories through games, and we use game stuff in stories. In fact, let me just give you a couple of quick examples. The middle game here in this screenshot is a game called Jet Set. It's a game that makes fun of Homeland Security lines at the airport, and you can play it when you're standing in line at the Homeland Security line. The top image is a screenshot from a game. It's a parodic game where you are an oil baron, and your goal is to warm the earth. And if you don't do it fast enough, you get penalized. This is a shot from a beautiful, easy but addictive game called Seed Ship, where you play the last starship with the last remnants of the human race trying to find a colony. And it is always a story every time you play it through. There are a lot of ways of doing this. I mean, you can think about games as branching narratives, where the narrative plays out a different way depending on each time you play it, the decisions you make. Games are radically interactive. I mean, if you don't play them, nothing happens. You actually have to poke at them to make them work. And sometimes games are an exploration of a vast and detailed space. These are 3 very different ways of doing it. And there are other aspects to it we can talk about, but I want to jump more closely into the role of education. So one of the ways you, so people have used games to deliver content. People play through games to understand things. And people have had students make games as well. There are other technologies we can talk about, and they've been popping up in all kinds of places. The mobile world is expanded rapidly for storytelling, including things like using QR codes to tie a story to a physical location. Virtual reality is a new way of telling stories, which is quite fascinating. We can talk about that if you like. People have been using augmented reality to tell stories. Mixed reality has a lot of promise for it. So in the education world, how we've been using this? Well, one is having students create stories for the reason we mentioned before. Sometimes we have faculty creating stories to share their content or to inspire students. The same with staff. We've seen scholars publishing research on digital storytelling as part of their research agenda. We've seen digital storytelling classes, certificates, and even a couple of degrees. So there are questions that we need to consider. So one of them is, who makes a story? What kind of story is it? And who supports it? So let me just give you a quick run through of a workflow, and then I want to hear some of your questions and thoughts. In order to make this happen in class, often you want to figure out how this integrates into a particular curriculum, what its purpose is in that class. And then it's pedagogical integration. What kind of pedagogical achievement are you trying to have? How you integrate this into a syllabus, into assessment? How do you grade it? What is its role in terms of the other work? And then you have to pick platforms. What technology are we going to use for this? And then how is it going to be supported? During a class, you have to think about explaining this to students, so what the purpose is and how it's going to work. You want to show them some projects, pre-existing projects. You want to remind them of assessment and think about ways of having group presentation. Digital storytelling presentation can be very moving, very exciting, very satisfying. There are a lot of ways to structure a project. The Story Center model works like this. It begins with determining a story idea, which can be hashed out. Then you write a voiceover first and record the voiceover. That's kind of the center of the video story. Then you teach the video editor and assemble different things into it, and then spend time editing it out, tying different images to different beats in the story, and then publishing it. A key part about the way the Story Center does this is by having students, participants talk to each other face to face during the production of this to help develop their stories. Then there are other aspects of this that you can do with media. You want to think about teaching students how to capture or assemble media. You want to think about editing on different tools. And also publication can cut in a few different ways. Do you want to publish this openly to the world, or do you want to keep it private for various reasons? For example, if you're concerned about copyright use in the piece, or if you're concerned about privacy. Within a class semester, you can increase complexity over time. Say start with a simple assignment and build up. You can have different assignments by different mediums, say having an audio story versus a visual story versus a video story. And you can interweave it with other assignments, have students write a paper and then do a digital story about it, for example. And then afterwards, you want to think about how to archive this, which is where I think the library plays a major role. You want to think about selecting examples that you can show students, and then remember your lessons learned. Frank mentions VoiceThread. VoiceThread is fantastic for this. I often use VoiceThread as a kind of intro to storytelling, getting people just to make something. And I find when people work through VoiceThread, they'll often get a sense of what medium or what approach they really want to use. It's kind of dry run. So it may be that that voice works for them and they want to do audio, for example. Let me pause for a second. Let me just ask for some general questions here. Let me stop sharing the slides. What are some of the thoughts you have about this? Deborah, do you want to say something about Spark? Before I ask you more questions, there's already a question from Kareem. Free online editing tools. Yeah, there are a few. You do want to think of some of the ones that are cheap or easily available too, that are just apps. Give me 1 second here. For example, Windows Movie Maker is actually a pretty amazing tool for the PC side, and iMovie is not as good as it used to be, but it's still very good on the Apple side. I really like WeVideo as a browser tool. If your bandwidth is sufficient, you can do some really good basic editing on that. Good question. What other questions do you have? And if you need to, you can either use a chat or you can seize the mic and start talking to me.
I'll go first, just to break the ice. Bryan, I was curious what you think about infograms. Infograms seem to be kind of all the rage too with data visualization. And do you see data visualization as a form of storytelling? I mean, does someone have to be narrating, or because there's a story in the data, but how does that fit with storytelling?
It's a great question. It's funny, when I ask people what isn't storytelling, usually a humanist will say data, and then a scientist will say that's not true. You can tell stories with data, and sometimes, again, remember my definition of story. For a given audience, sometimes data can tell a story by itself. Infographics can tell a story, and there are a lot of ways of doing it, off of the kind of flow chart method, where you see, things change over time. And in many ways, infographics really start to resemble comics in that way, which is very, very exciting, I think. So, you can really go in that direction. But yeah, infographics is a really, really good way. Thanks for asking that. How about the rest of you? Now the ice is shattered. Does this make sense? Does this sound plausible? Is this something that you'd want to try? What questions do you have? And you can ask me anything. This is, like, should we use video? Should we use audio? What are the downsides?
I love all of this information, and I've used a few of these related ideas for image and text course and for creative writing and some other courses. School of Business wants to do more with storytelling in the curriculum, and it's a great way to help people with building writing across the curriculum, and especially because we can see video work as a kind of writing. But all of this is awesome and really exciting. I'd love to see if we could, if people are real interested, maybe we could keep this going with some conversations or brown bags or something where people share what they're doing.
That would be great. And a lot of campuses do this. Amy asks about downsides. So one downside, this is time consuming. You cannot do this quickly. I managed to do a complete digital storytelling workshop in 9 hours, and that was insane. I mean, that was really pushing the edge of it. So to do it right, you need to devote class time to it, and that's a downside. I think it's rewarding, but it doesn't fit for everybody. A second is you can run into issues of if you're using personal stories, that's always a risk whenever you're doing personal anything in higher education. Questions of privacy laws as well as sensitivities. And the third is it just doesn't fit for everything. Right? I mean, you might not need to do a digital story for every single class, so it doesn't always work. And the fourth is tech support can be done badly, and you really need to set it up well.
Bryan, go ahead, Russ.
I'm part of the business school here that Karen was referring to. So yeah, I wanted to ask, we want students to be able to tell the story about the data. So let's say the data is fairly dry and it's maybe, I don't know, some sort of result on policy or something. Mm-hmm. Part of what I imagined was like to tell them to use their imagination to come up with maybe a fiction story that has details of the data with it. So you can convey it to the average Joe, the potential importance of these findings.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know if you've got comments on how we could do that better or little things that you could share, but that was a direction we'd like to maybe head. And it might be in an interdisciplinary type of class.
Oh, it's a long-standing business pedagogy. I mean, you think about case studies, right? Which have to be realistic. They have to be nonfiction in that sense, or else you're talking about fantasy. So we always and at the same time, you often can make up a company. So widget .com or something. And then you can flesh it out by having characters. I mean, it's a kind of corporate training practice to have, okay, here is Mary. She's running into this ethical problem in purchasing something, and so on. So you can add as much as you like. I think the trick would be trying to balance that, trying to make the business case as human as possible without turning it into a novel. I mean, if it's a novel.
I think your point that you made about assessment is really important. I think we've all sort of figured out roughly how to assess written work, but I think the idea of assessing a digital story is a little overwhelming. Can you give us some
Sure.
framework?
Okay. So first of all, people have been wrestling with this for about 20 years. So if you just quickly Google something like digital storytelling rubric or digital storytelling assessment, you won't have to talk to me ever again. I mean, there's tons of stuff for that. Often people set up a rubric, and think about it this way. We've been assessing multimedia in a lot of ways before. So if we've had students give a presentation, you think about how, okay, part of it is you're assessing the content. Do they make an argument? Are they using the right evidence? Are they addressing the problems you want them to address? And then there's the form that's unique to a presentation. I mean, can they speak clearly? Do they mumble? Do they use slides, depending on the whole setup? If you have a student make a poster, it's the same thing. I mean, if they're doing a poster about a chemical reaction, do they get the chemical reaction right? I mean, are they producing this in the correct way? Are they hitting all the right points? And then, is the poster lovely? I mean, is the poster legible? Can you go through all this? That's the same thing with digital storytelling. I mean, if a student is making a narrative that's, say, autobiographical, you can ask the content questions. Does this address the class? Does this make sense? Is this clear? Is this using the right kind of thinking that you want the class to be doing? And then you can assess the technical details. So if it's a video, for example, how good is the sound quality? Are the images clear? How is the editing? And then depends on the curriculum and how deep you want to go into this. Do you want to talk about, say, cuts? Do you want to talk about music and voice and sound effects? It depends on your demands, but it's really that combination of content and form. And again, we've been down this before when we have students make web pages. Right? If we have students make a physical artifact, like in the sciences, making an artifact of, say, a chemical model. So it's easier to do than it sounds.
But the idea of being able to actually give your feedback in the location where the feedback is needed, you know, like there used to be a company, UCU, I don't know if they're still in business. There are some education companies that use it for teacher education feedback, where you can stop the video at a certain location and you can give your feedback at that spot.
Yeah.
Like on a paper where you can write, this is where you need to work on this thing, but in a digital storytelling environment, that becomes more complicated. So.
It's more or less complicated. I mean, you can, if you have a performance of sorts, you can set it up as, you can have live feedback, much like a presentation of a poster or an oral presentation. You know, you get feedback right away, then you take notes, and then you can have your students do the same thing. You can have them give as much feedback, you know, live as you need. You can there are all kinds of ways you can set this up. You can use new technologies too. For example, you know, you can, if students publish this through YouTube, for example, you can have them give feedback and comments on YouTube, or have them make their own. Comments as a video format, for example. You know, there are a lot of ways you can do this. This is a good question. It's a good question. Friends, I'm just about out of time. Oh, by the way, Professor Binder mentions The Machine Stops, which is a fantastic story. I teach that in one of my technology classes. Russ, you have to go to class too, I understand. Thank you all. Corinne, we're going to be doing another version of this later today, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yep, we'll have another one today at 6 o'clock Central Time. So you'll have to translate that into everybody's different time zones. But this was wonderful, Dr. Alexander. Some great commentary, lots of good questions, a wonderful presentation, and thank you guys for joining us. Do you have anything else to add, Bryan, on your end?
I did a little self-promotion. I shared my book, and I shared my email address. I would love to hear from everybody else. I would love to hear what you're thinking, and I'd love to answer questions. I mean, one nice thing is people have been working on this for a while, so there are a lot of examples. There's a lot you can draw upon.
Well, wonderful, and we'll make sure that everybody has copies of has your email address and knows what that book is, so we can get that out there.
Fantastic.
All right.
Well, thank you so much.
Yep, thank you, everybody, and if you guys want to join us again this evening at 6 Central Time, we'll see you then. If not, I'm sure we'll have a new group. So.
Well, happy storytelling, everybody. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Andrea, before everybody goes.
Yes.
Oh, she's muted.
Oh, Corinne, you're muted.
Oh, wait till you stop recording, sorry.